Welcome everybody. So hello everyone. My name is Bing Chen. I'm on the faculty of Mott School for Public International Affairs here at Brew College, the City University in New York. On behalf of the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management, we welcome joining us at this webinar, Building Together Mergers and the Sustained Collaboration Part 2. And for those who join us for the first time, this is actually the continuation conversation we had 3 weeks ago in part 1. And at this 3 weeks ago, we discussed the question why nonprofits should consider mergers and sustained collaborations. And today we're going to talk about the question of how. What are the key issues you have to contemplate when you're considering mergers and sustained collaborations? We're very happy to have 4 panelists join us today. And the first 2 who also joined us last time, and Jessie Cavanaro is a principal of Sea Change, and she's leading the Sea Change Lodestar Fund for Nonprofit Collaboration, a New York Merger Acquisition and Collaboration Fund. Each fund makes grants to support the nonprofits interested in exploring and planning collaboration. Prior to joining the Sea Change, Jessie was an associate director at the CCS fundraising. Before her transition to the nonprofit sector, and Jessie spent 6 years in investment banking sector. As a proud native New Yorker, and she's a graduate of Cornell University. And today, Jessie is going to provide us with some funder's perspective on the mergers and sustained collaboration. Last time, we also have very pleased to have Daniel Rabuzzi, and he's founder and lead consultant at the Indigo Facent Area C, Change Management Merger Advisory for Social Enterprises. And Daniel started his career in corporate finance and the manufacturer Hanover Trust Company. She earned his doctorate in history at Johns Hopkins University. And Daniel has over 3 decades experience of leading, crafting, and executing organizational changes, including mergers and sustained collaborations. And today we're going to ask him to share with his first-hand experience about how to implement sustained collaboration and the mergers. It comes no surprise that we have a lot of legal issues to deal with. So today we're also very pleased to have 2 legal experts to join our panel to provide their insights. We have Deborah Bayer, and she's founder and principal for Deborah Bayer Law, when she was a general counsel for the New York City Department of Small Business Services. Deborah brings a passion for working with nonprofit organizations. I quote her words, "I'm essentially a corporate lawyer for nonprofits. This is very much a social entrepreneurship. Nonprofits are doing the things I care about." And Deborah received the GED from NYU School of Law and a BA in Political Science from Rutgers College. She's a member of the NYC Nonprofit Coordinating Committee's Government Affairs Committee and also a member of NYC Bar Association. We also have Neil Stevenson, and he's a senior staff attorney responsible for Lawyers Alliance Economic Opportunity Program area. And prior to joining Lawyers Alliances, Stevenson was a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society and a partner at Eaton and Van Winkle. And he received an LLM from Columbia School of Law, as well as Area B joint honors from the University of Glasgow. Welcome 4 panelists to join us. And we received a number of the questions from the audience in advance. So I think it's the best way for us to structure our discussion around these questions. At the meantime, you're welcome to type in your question at the chat boxes. I will monitor these chat boxes and to give this question to the audience, to the panelists at the same time. And we also recorded our part 1 webinar. You're welcome to check out from Mott School's website. So let me start with the question. The first several questions actually related to the why question. I think it's serving as a nice transition to this how questions. So the first question is, so if you are larger, more financially sustained than nonprofit organizations, so what is the value added or benefits of consider a merger or collaboration? So Daniel probably can start with this question.
Sure, and I'm sure, thank you, Ben. Any of the colleagues, of course, could answer this as well. Before I plunge in, I think we'd be remiss not to note a really important publication that came out just 2 days ago, not least because Jess is quoted there, and it emphasizes that what we're talking about today is literally part of the national philanthropic and nonprofit conversation. So if you're not familiar with this, I would encourage those listening. The Stanford Social Innovation Review 2 days ago published a major, very long article focusing on the importance, necessity really, of sustained collaboration for and with nonprofits. And I just have to note that Jessica Cavanero, obviously panelist here, quoted at length, Sea Change Capital is one of the drivers of this conversation. So again, a lot of background there. Some of it will even answer questions or preempt some of the questions folks may have. So our timing here, we did not collaborate on that prior, but I think it's fair to say there's a lot of us thinking now about this nationally. So I'm sure Jess can add much to that in the course of this conversation. Very specifically, a quick answer. There are many answers to why a larger, more financially sustained or sustainable organization may wish to engage in a sustained collaboration with what's implicit here is an organization that may not be quite as robust. Again, many different reasons. Every case is a bit different. I'll put one on the table, which is organizationally, and that is a make or buy decision. In other words, if, quick hypothetical, let's say that you are a leader in certain elements of health and human services, you're serving a clientele that may need some service that you yourselves do not provide. But remember, from the perspective of your beneficiary, it's all one and the same, one package. It's a make or buy decision for you. You may be much larger, more financial. You're saying, look, it'll cost us $2 to $5 million over 3 years to create a teen pregnancy prevention program. The one piece that's lacking in our portfolio. Presumably, you're already, let's say you're in the foster care network. Presumably you're looking around, you already know some folks. It would make better strategic sense in that case for you. And it may well be that this provider is not as financially robust as you are, but they in fact have a great program that on balance, it would cost you more to build yourselves. So there's just a quick example, hypothetically. I've seen this though in reality many times, and it's a classic make or buy sort of decision that you would make. So I'll pause there.
Anyone else want to jump on to weighing on this question?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. And Daniel, thank you so much for that shout out. Just delighted to be.
Entirely deserved. Seriously, you guys are, I mean that, right?
Well, we have learned a lot from our nonprofit partners. And so it's great to just be back on this panel and continue this discussion. But as Daniel says, I think it's important to shift the conversation from this is a finance discussion. These are the traditional for-profit mentality ways in which we would operate. The benefits for a large financially stable organization are the same as the benefits for a smaller, perhaps more fragile organization, if you think about it with program and mission first. All of these transactions are really designed to help organizations increase their impact, limit disruption in service, and add to their programmatic and perhaps organizational capacities and expertise in ways in which they might not be able to do on their own or fast enough on their own. And so all to Daniel's point, think about this as opportunity, think about this in terms of program, think about this in terms of mission. And then I hope that whomever has asked this will start to really see the benefits of why this could be helpful.
So I think our discussion seems to address the second question I'm going to ask. That is are the mergers and collaboration between organizations is the final goal for nonprofit, or harder ways to fix finance and the program problems? I think you two kind of address this question. So I want to move on to another question is, there's a misconception that a nonprofit organization can shed its a liability through a merger. So probably our legal experts can jump in on this to address, is that a misperception or?
You want to take it, Deb?
Sure,
Yeah,
I think,
Deborah, or
you know,
either is Neil.
it's not a merger or a collaboration isn't a bankruptcy. So no, you don't just sort of lose all your liabilities. And I think it depends on sort of what type of arrangement you're contemplating. If it's a straightforward collaboration, then no, it doesn't impact your liabilities. It can reduce your expenses if you're doing cost sharing, or if you're sharing the costs of carrying out a program, and the reduction in your expenses can certainly ultimately reduce your liabilities, but it isn't a direct reduction of your liabilities. If you're talking about a merger, an actual merger of your organization into another organization, then that organization would take your liabilities. And the third option is an asset sale, where your organization sells its assets to another organization, and then usually and holds on to its liabilities, and then usually dissolves after that.
Neil, do you have any take on that?
Well, I think that Deb got it exactly right. And just wondering, to what extent the audience is aware of what the spectrum from a legal perspective is for these types of collaborations. If you have just a second, perhaps I could share my screen and show you a quick, let's see if I can do that.
Yes, please.
You see that okay? Okay. So this, if you look on the left-hand side of this, as Deb was saying, you've merger consolidation.
No, wait, I don't see the screen. I don't see the share screen.
Oh, sorry. Okay, hold on.
Could you try again? Or?
Yeah, I'll try that again. Share my screen. Share. Try it again. Seeing it now?
Yeah, yes. That's. Could you make them bigger, a little bit bigger, or?
Is that?
Yes.
That work?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Good.
Sorry. So on the left-hand side there, just as Deb was saying, if you're doing a merger consolidation, that's the most formal integration of the kind of transaction that you could have. And that's a situation where, the assets go and the liabilities go, and there's one surviving entity. And if you go all the way over to the right-hand side of that slide, you'll see the least degree of integration and the most retention of independence and autonomy, where of course you would not expect any change to your assets or your liabilities. You're usually probably, just as we are terming it, they're coordinating or collaborating in a relatively informal way, maybe pursuant to an MOU or maybe a contract indeed, but perhaps not a huge amount at risk. Certainly no transfer or assumption of liabilities. And in between, there are other legal options, legal structures that you can use, which may or may not take into account some shift or change or transfer of specific liabilities that party A or party B may have. But basically, the answer is no. You do not shed your liabilities by entering into any of these transactions. You can address responsibility for your liabilities in any of these transactions, but it's a separate question.
And Ben and colleagues, if I just make the point that, for example, about a decade ago, I was involved in negotiations, 2 nonprofits that fit in every possible way, certainly programmatically. And in fact, the deal did not get done. It was right that it didn't, because one side was bringing in substantial bank debt, and the bank was not willing to negotiate on that, and so on and so forth. So these are very real, and it wasn't as if magically through the merger the bank was going to relinquish its claim to us. That doesn't happen, as our good friends are noting here, and that's real. And that deal did not happen for that reason, which is a real pity, since programmatically it would have made sense. But third-party banks were not interested in a restructuring of that debt.
So in Neil's framework, talk about the joint venture. There's a question about the social enterprises and joint venture. The question is how to leverage an existing 501c3 as a pass-through versus grant to fund the social enterprises or joint venture. They want to address
need
this
to
question?
I don't know if Debbie understands it better, but I'm not quite sure I understand exactly what the relationship is that's contemplated here. It's a very interesting area, I have to say, which is the relationship often between nonprofit, 501c3, and for-profit, and exactly how monies, for example, raised by the nonprofit can be utilized by the for-profit or for the benefit of the for-profit, especially if the for-profit is obviously not just a wholly owned subsidiary of the nonprofit. But I'm not quite sure what the questioner is contemplating here. I guess the one caveat I would offer, lawyers, of course, wet blanket, would be that be very careful about thinking that you can simply use your 501c3 as a fundraising channel and then take those monies and utilize them in a for-profit enterprise, a joint venture enterprise, without being very cognizant of the significant restrictions that come with use of those monies by the nonprofit. If that's what they're getting at, the idea that the nonprofit would raise charitable dollars and then contribute those charitable dollars as capital to a for-profit entity in which the nonprofit may be a participant as part of the joint venture, but if it doesn't own it 100%, there are a lot of issues associated with that.
Okay. So another related question is, what do you think of the scenario if you're working with a new organization outside the mission of the nonprofit, but recipients would still be the beneficiaries? My guess is new organization, the question referred to is a for-profit outside of the nonprofit. But the beneficiary will still be the same. The recipients will still be the same. I think it's talk about the cross-sectoral collaboration here. What do you think about this idea?
So I'll jump in there. I think it's always okay to, have collaborators out there that are providing complementary services to your beneficiaries and to coordinate with them. I think if you're talking about a situation where you're endorsing another an organization or another company's services, you have to be very careful around those types of endorsements. And like Neil said, if it's a for-profit, there are actually specific rules around joint ventures between for-profits and not-for-profits.
Okay.
And so that's something that you always want to be extra careful with. But, to the extent that you're spending your organization's dollars to pursue your organization's mission, you're in good legal ground. If the other organization or entity is providing complementary services, but they're paying for those services as opposed to you funding them providing those services, then I think you're in a pretty good position. The point at which you start having to look at whether you're still fitting in where your 501c3 mission is if you start funding, thinking about funding another entity that's providing services that fall outside what your certificate of incorporation authorizes your organization to do.
Yes, go ahead, and yeah.
So that's, I think, Deb gave a very good description of exactly the considerations that a nonprofit has to bear in mind. I'll just give one other scenario, one other wrinkle in that scenario situation, which is fun to try to resolve. So the nonprofit already provides, the for-profit already provides services that are very similar to the services that the nonprofit wants to provide, but just to a different class. The for-profit provides them to those who can pay. The nonprofit wants to provide them to those who can't pay. And the issue is if the nonprofit uses the for-profit to provide those services, in other words, a nonprofit pays for those who can't afford to pay to receive those services, the nonprofit still has to be careful about its selection of the provider of those services, particularly, for example, if the nonprofit has any kind of overlap in control or board representation between the for-profit and the nonprofit. In other words, the for-profit, the people owning the for-profit establish the nonprofit to raise money to pay for services that the for-profit then delivers. That can be very problematic at think that was Deb was referring to as well.
Wow.
I'd just like to add to that in case we are misinterpreting the question. It's not, the mission of organizations is often fairly broad. And sometimes these collaborations can come up from between not obvious partners. So for example, when the Alpha Workshop, which was a workforce development organization founded to support the LGBTQIA community in response to the AIDS epidemic, merged into the Jewish board, it was not an exactly obvious partnership. But each of the boards looked at their missions, which was to empower their beneficiaries, help them develop real skills in which they might be able to go out and gain gainful employment. And they've decided that it was complementary enough to do the transaction. And so in case we are misinterpreting this, if there is an opportunity to partner with perhaps a not obvious choice, but it makes sense from a programmatic and mission perspective, that is absolutely something that people should and could pursue.
Good. So we have a question from the audience. It's about the probably related is, what additional partnership consideration does the current pandemic environment present?
I mean, I'm going to jump in for a second. I'm going to piggyback actually off of what Jess was just noting for us. I mean, look, on the one hand, obviously we're in the midst of a colossal crisis of public health, finance, and all the rest of it. We all know that. But I want to keep focusing, as you just did, opportunities to work with potential partners that you may not have thought about before. I mean, I think part of what this is forcing all of us to do in the positive way, I'm going to focus on the positive, is to say, wow, look, there's somebody doing something complementary potentially to us that we're aware of each other. We haven't really talked to them as much before, perhaps. I think this gives us all an opportunity to rethink, in fact, how we deliver certain services, particularly if it's to ultimately the same beneficiaries or a cognate group. And I always remind, for those of us coming more out of the practitioner side, the beneficiaries often, most likely, don't really perceive that many differences between these different institutional organizations. They just want the service. So long story short, I think what Jess is saying is right. I would imagine, I'm in conversations with some, in pre-COVID times would have been, maybe remarkably different sorts of groups who are finding their way to each other a little bit. So I'll just leave it at that and say that I think this gives us an opportunity to think, it clears the board, new thinking. And we should encourage that, as long, of course, looking at Neil and Deborah and our legal friends, obviously within the proper legal frameworks.
Great.
I was actually going to jump in and also just say that I think there's there's a consideration that's always a consideration with mergers and collaborations, which is the melding of different cultures. And I think particularly right now, when, all workplaces and all business locations, nonprofit locations are having to figure out how to adjust to the physically returning to the workplace and to the world. I think that that looking carefully at the culture between your organization and the other organization is going to be particularly attenuated right now in terms of what types of workplace policies you're going to implement, how conservative you're going to be with your staff and with how you deal with your customers or beneficiaries, and also just how careful different organizations are going to take different tacks around things like waivers of liability, temperature checks, things like that. So I think the differences in culture, the differences in boards, and the differences in risk tolerance and safety focus will be really, really important, particularly at this time.
Great, Deborah's the comments about culture. Actually, there's some questions about how to address cultural differences and cultural alignment if you decided to move into or more to organization come together. I think that Daniel, you have some first experience of leading those organizational changes. Could you share your experience how to address these cultural differences or cultural alignment?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's exceptionally difficult, right? I mean, if getting, if making sure that the numbers and the legal framework is right, and they simply have to be, as I always say, right, tight, and proper. That's, you know, basic terms of trying to do a deal. The cultural piece is always difficult, in part because even defining what culture is, it radically differs even among folks that think they understand what they mean on the same team. So in fact, what a potential sustained collaboration does is actually forces people both to go back to their articles of incorporation, their bylaws, the mission, to really remind themselves, oh, what is it that we in fact state we do? And then to put the microscope under themselves to say, oh, this vaunted culture that we talk about, what is it exactly? And what almost always happens is, what I have seen when the sustained collaboration goes less well or doesn't go at all, it's not just between the two organizations. What I have quite frequently seen is that it highlights pre-existing stress lines within each of the organizations. In other words, that's what you have to focus on first. You cannot build a joint house if even one, let alone both of the foundations are already cracked. So what that means is being, I have to say this way, you have to be ruthless to be effective. You need to have a board and a senior leadership that is willing to look really hard at itself and figure out what exactly is this culture we're talking about, what needs to be preserved. And that means you have to talk first and foremost with your beneficiaries and with your staff. And there's no easy road to this. And where I've seen things, we're all too friendly at times. You get X months, even years down the road, and then realize, oh my gosh, we never really did what I call a cultural inventory, a cultural mapping process. And then to have double feedback loops. There's another question that's somebody sent in advance, which is really a cognate or corollary to this, which is, let's say everybody thinks they see the cultural meshing happening up front, but maybe temperatures cool down a little bit afterwards. You need to build in those routine checks. And if you need to pull the plug, this is just me speaking, but I think I've seen this effectively done. I know I've done it. It's better to pull the plug if you need to early than to keep fumbling your way down the line. So you need to have really hard conversations. And that includes, you know, to put things on the table, right? These are diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations. You need to look at hierarchy. I have seen it many times where the CEO and the board are all excited about the potential sustained collaboration of whatever sort that it is. And then when you get down to who's going to actually implement on the ground, it is not what they wish to do, but given the power dynamics, it's very difficult for them on the ground to say, not really something that we think is going to work. You know, we're a bunch of real perfectionist, detail-oriented folks. That team over there, we know them, we love them, but they don't even conduct meetings the way we do. So you need to build in a way in which your frontline teams, not least, and your beneficiaries, above all, have feedback into this, because what looks great at the board level can often come a cropper if you haven't put that in place. That's hard work. There's no easy way around that. You can't even start talking legal structures or accounts and balance sheets before you get that piece right.
So I think Daniel's point is that the cultural discussion should be well before, even before the legal discussions.
Yeah, Ben, I would add, just to echo what Daniel said and reference our previous discussion, culture begins at the individual organizational level. And it starts really with who are your clients and what are your values for serving them and how that leads to your approach. And even internally, you may think your culture is one way, but then when you think about the way in which you engage in that work and have an honest internal discussion, often fraught, let's not mix words about that, you might find out that your culture is quite different. We have made a grant, and I know that this webinar is being recorded, so forgive me, 4 transactions which were very close to the finish line, one in particular where there was a large organization that built its program around building up the capacity of school administrators. And they wanted to merge with an organization that built its capacity around, or built its program around building capacity for teachers. On paper, it looked great. They had lots of funding pre-committed. They were ready to sign on the dotted line. But when I spoke with the board chairs, it was very clear that their cultures were different because their approaches and their client bases were different. One was very top down, one was very bottoms up. So we made a grant to bring in a facilitator for a half-day session to formalize the term sheet, betting that by the end of hour 3, they would have called the deal off. It took them until hour 6 to call the deal off, but it wound up saving them lots of time, lots of effort, and slugging through what would have been a very difficult transition period post-execution of the documents.
Oh, that's a really good example. Actually, a related question is that if you decided in the scenario Jesse just described, that you decided not to marry or decided to, it's not a good way to move forward, is there any exit strategy from this collaboration or dissolving these relationships?
Something that we see change all the time is that everyone remembers the end of the story. So finding a way to celebrate what you've learned internally and through the process, and trying your best to exit as friends. It sounds very straightforward, but is pretty difficult. But that has been the best approach so far that we've seen. It also bleeds into when is an appropriate time to tell a funder that you might be doing this, because funders rightfully get fairly nervous, or have historically gotten fairly nervous, when they hear that some of their favorite organizations are doing things that might change the way in which they work.
I want to just echo that strongly. There, a concept that I like to use is this same thing. It's the graceful exit. I mean, exits are actually part of organizational life, just as they are, you know, they exist, right? So it is, and people remember how gracefully you exited when it comes to it. And I also remember markets, and networks, systems, markets have memories, they have history. You may well be 10 years down the line, either personally or organizationally, back in a conversation with individuals who you were once in this, you had to dissolve whatever it was or didn't quite work. I've been in that situation, and it's much better when you're able to say, it didn't work that time, but we all worked it out. It was understandable what happened. We learned from it, and we're still friends in the general sense. I think that's an important message, by the way. As we're going through what we're going through, there's a lot of stress, to put it very, very obviously. But it's a little like, I've been through ups and downs over many years, and it's nice to know that 10 years from now, people will remember how you acted, whether your exits, some exits are going to be inevitable. Did you exit gracefully? To Jess's point, did you work it out? You'll be remembered for that ending. That's very true. It's hard to think that way when we're in the midst of stuff right now, but that's a very,
I'd just like to add one thing there, what Daniel and Jess just said. I agree completely. Better not to do the deal than to do a bad deal. But in terms of exiting or stopping, you should also, if you can, take a moment to just see, well, it may not be what we thought it was going to be, but is there a value here? We can do a smaller or a slightly different transaction. Mm-hmm. We're not going to merge, but we could share some resources, or we could otherwise collaborate. So I just want to remind people that, not to be too fixed in their ideas, and it's kind of where we started the conversation, that the form follows the function. So you may decide, this is not a good idea because the cultures will never properly mesh. But we could do X, which is coming out of all the work that you've done up to that point.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Good. So there's a question from the audience: is how prevalent are mergers and acquisitions in the nonprofit industry? So anybody have any idea about how prevalent mergers acquisition in the nonprofit industry?
I don't know the statistics, but I would say in my practice, we do a fair number of asset transfers, and a lot of formal long-term collaboration agreements. But I have not done a lot of actual mergers where you're merging the assets and liabilities of one nonprofit into another.
Daniel, you want to say something? Or
I think Jess had something on her mind.
I'm going to let Neil go first.
I was just going to, I'll definitely echo what Deb said. I think people often use the terminology is a little unreliable. They use the term merger when what they mean is, I want to talk to you about maybe working together. And so I think merger is such a complete transaction that it's not surprising, as Deb says, that that's often not the choice. And in fact, from the surviving entity's perspective, they need a good reason to do a merger if they can achieve the same ends some other way. So I would say, it's not particularly prevalent, the formal merger, but lots of collaboration and lots of good reasons to do so.
Yeah, I would say to everyone's point that the legal transaction of merging is probably a lot less, but that term is broadly abused and used as a catch-all for a lot of the transactions and types of collaborations that we're talking about. The thing that we see most often when people talk about merging is a parent subsidiary structure. But also, because we're talking about the full spectrum of collaboration, there's lots of stuff that just doesn't hit a reliable place to statistically pull the data, right? So if you're having an agreement on a programmatic partnership that's solidified by an MOU, if you are co-locating, if you're sharing staff, much of that, all of that is part of this. And it just doesn't reliably get captured. What I can say from an empirical standpoint is that I get about 100 calls a year from organizations across the country that are thinking about doing this work. Some of those transition into a deal within a 6-month to 18-month period. Some of them take 5 years. And so the volume is there. When these occur is a lot different.
Yeah, actually, I can add on some to this question is many years ago, and the Bridgespan did some study. They compared the merger acquisition rate between the nonprofit and the for-profit sector. They strictly talk about the merger acquisition, legally speaking. What they find out is that actually they're pretty identical. The merger and the acquisition rate in the nonprofit and for-profit are pretty identical. So Neil, do you want to jump on some?
No, I'm just saying that's very interesting, actually. That's a very interesting statistic. It would seem to suggest that some of the truly well-considered driving considerations are similar for a nonprofit and for a for-profit in making that kind of transactional.
Actually, there's go ahead, Daniel.
I was just saying 2 quick comments. One is to agree with all of us very much. And one of the things I really appreciate about the article, again, in the Stanford Social Innovation Review and what SeaChange is doing with its counterparts, Jessica tell us much more, across the country, is putting out, I think, a new term of art that works, right? Sustained collaboration, which is a wonderful umbrella term that sweeps up a variety of different legal possibilities. I just think it's good to use that term. And secondly, I having come years ago from the for-profit side, I think there is this interesting misperception that we don't do as much of this in our nonprofit sector, partly because we don't have the Wall Street Journal routinely and Fortune and Business Week, et cetera. There's a huge media industry that, of course, focuses, and those deal sizes are vastly larger. If you looked at deal size, it wouldn't even be remotely comparable. But the truth is, under it, as small as our deals may be in dollar terms, I think there are far more happens than we sometimes realize, because we're like, well, where's the where's the mega merger? Well, no, we're small.
Yeah, there's actually a comment from the audience echoing our discussion. Such an interesting, important question about the actual prevalence and the occurrence of emerging alliances. So there's a lot to be done to educate the field about the spectrum of options what might be best in a given circumstances. So the real missing piece is the collective understanding of a nonprofit business model and the variable options. There's a question about the merger alliances. Since the merger asset transfer typically involving attorney general or charity regulators, so what are the variation in experience, if you can share with us?
So I'll take that one to begin with, and Deb, jump in and correct me if I get this wrong. So yes, that's, if you're looking at a kind of, again, the spectrum of collaborations, there's a lot of things that you can do, as Jess was indicating, that will not require specific pre-approval or filing disclosure from the regulatory authority in New York. That would be the Charities Bureau, the Attorney General's Charities Bureau. But when you get to these more formal type of transactions, kind of everything from merger, consolidation, or asset transfer, if the asset is, you know, all or substantially all of the transferring organization's assets, that clearly does. That's where the regulator comes in. You want to know if material changes of that sort to an organization. So that's a very important point, I think, in terms of organizations that are considering collaborating, deciding how to go about it, and at what point the degree of integration is such that it's going to require or merits seeking the approval or the consent of the Attorney General.
And just to jump on what Neil said, I think it's helpful to think in terms of the point at which you're going to have to start dealing with the Charities Bureau or the Attorney General of another state is that usually that's a situation where one of the two entities is going to cease to exist, where the actual entity is going to no longer exist. But all these other collaborations that we're talking about, whether it's co-locating or collaborating on a project or cost sharing, or even a situation where you've decided to adjust how your boards of directors get elected, where one organization might have a membership in the other organization and can elect the boards to that second organization. All of these other types of collaborations, both entities continue to exist, both entities continue to file Form 990s, both entities continue to have boards of directors, both entities are still subject to all the legal requirements of a separate entity. They have just decided to collaborate in this particular way. So it really has to do with whether the entity still will continue or not.
So there's actually a question about the exit. Do you recommend the exit agreements if the deal does not go forward and the use of the NDAs? I don't know what is NDAs. The question is whether you recommend the exit agreements if the deal does not go forward.
Yeah, so I think, again, that has a lot to do with what the deal is, right? Like if you're considering a full-on corporate transaction, you're going to go through a very formal due diligence process. And if you don't ultimately decide to move forward, then there won't be an agreement. So there won't be anything to exit. If you're talking about another type of arrangement, a cost-sharing arrangement, a co-location arrangement, a collaboration arrangement, I always suggest that those be in writing and that they sort of spell out how things will be divided and how things will get unwound at the end, if there's an assumed end, or if there's not an assumed end, if things don't work out. So that's why there are a lot of informal collaborations, and there are appropriate times to just have an informal collaboration. But to the extent that things can be put down in writing, with a meeting of the minds that include things like how it's going to work if the collaboration ends or when the collaboration ends, that can really help avoid problems down the line.
Say, Jess, go ahead.
Yeah, so because I've seen this and it's terrible, if you get down a path where you've started to talk to funders about your potential collaboration and you ultimately decide not to do it, while you may not have a formal exit plan in place, it's very important to work together on how you communicate why you have not moved forward. I use the wedding analogy a lot, but when people receive the invitation to the wedding and it doesn't happen, having a shared and common explanation why is always important, particularly if you need to maintain those funder relationships. Jointly controlling that narrative. Can't underscore it enough.
Good. So now let's move into another question is, if you decided to merge your acquisition or the consolidation, how to determine the leadership, including executive director, the board, and of the new organization?
I can jump in with the first stab on this. Again, I get all the really tough ones, right? This is the go no go sort of stuff, and too often what happens is there's a desire to to be what I call falsely kind. In other words, the more we are in the true merger sort of world, leadership is going to be unique. It's going to be unitary. So if you haven't worked out right at the get, actually, who the remaining ED is going to be and what your board looks like in general principle, you've got one heck of a lot of work to do. And I think what often happens, people have a real desire, especially because typically it's among friends, to say, well, we're going to go and we'll be a co-this and a co-that. Again, the others may differ, but from my experience, those rarely work, or certainly they work less well than people hope. That's a cultural issue. Secondly, people also start attempting to do things like, well, we're going to have, look, a lot of this is your organization chart, your salary range calibrations, your titles. This is where all of this stuff emerges, right? And they become stalking horses for the deep cultural issues, either work or don't. And so you need to, very early on, make it clear, these are the titles we're going to use. I have seen drawn out battles over something. What program manager means in organization X and what program manager means in organization Y turn out to be really different. I mean, you have to get down to job descriptions, et cetera, which again have legal parameters as well. So I would say that's really one of those upfront job one sort of things, right? Is to say, well, we all look like we can get along from the outside. Let's talk now. Wait, we need clear lines here on the org chart. People try to paper, oh, we're going to have a dotted line here and you'll be in a matrix and it'll sort of all work out. It typically doesn't. Again, this is my experience, my opinion. Others may differ. But I think that's part of that hard work up front to find out, are you actually as compatible as you seem to be? And you don't, to get to Jess's point, if you have papered that over and then suddenly you're, again, to use the wedding analogy, you're a day away from the wedding and you realize, ooh, actually this won't work. I'd say you don't want to get to that stage if you can help it. So I'll pause there, but this is down to the really granular stuff that typically doesn't get surfaced unless somebody is pushing you hard to do so.
It is a related question about this. That is, to what extent is the fact that the two boards as well as two senior teams need to be merged and people just have huge stakes at play, loss of jobs, ego, identity. To what extent is this a significant obstacle and how is it dealt with successfully? One question from the audience.
I'll go real quick because I know others have points. Again, it's a corollary to what we just said. And by the way, it's absolutely no different in my experience. This isn't peculiar to the nonprofit sector. At least, I worked primarily with founders and family businesses when I was a banker, and the dynamics, in essence, were pretty much the same. So yeah, this is the hard work. It's not easy. Things that look logical on paper, like, oh gosh, we really are complementary. We should be able to do this in order to treble the volume of caseworkers per beneficiary in our precinct. It should work. But you know what? When you start peeling it back, two boards, I mean, look, board dynamics with one board are extremely difficult. It becomes not just arithmetic, but actually logarithmic when you start talking about trying to put two boards together. So I'm just stressing that's really hard work, and it's the sort of thing that you don't embark on lightly. You need to think about that really hard. And again, final point, too much what I call false courtesy. It's like, oh, we'll kind of work it out later. We'll all kind of get to know each other. No, you need to sit down and discover who's not going to be on your board when you finish, who needs to leave now, who should be stepping up, what's your senior team really going to look like. You need to do that earlier, not later, in my experience.
So we seem to be talk a lot about the unsuccessful failures. So let's move on to the question. So what are the key elements of successful long-term collaborations? How do you know when it's been successful? So what are the examples of a real success? So let's get more positive about that.
I think success is really driven by what you want to achieve, whether it's expanding your program, getting to a new funding base, growing to a new geography, bringing on new talent, either at the staff level, at the board level. When we ask our nonprofit partners to report back on their successes, we always have a drive from them because every deal is going to have a different set of metrics to which the board and the leadership and the staff feel are important. But I would say unequivocally, very few of these transactions are driven by cost savings. I just need to get that out there. It's of the, I think, 65 grants in the NIMAC portfolio, less than 5 have been explicitly motivated by cost savings. And so when we talk about bringing the for-profit expertise and thinking to these transactions, just understand that almost everyone determines and thinks about their success in relation to the clients that they serve and the communities that they are helping.
Okay. Any other thoughts or?
Yeah, I would just highlight that we're constantly coming back to mission, to the beneficiaries, to their stakeholders, those whom you serve, that there may be cost savings along the way. That's a good thing, obviously, and there probably will be some efficiencies. But the point is that whatever your metric is that your funders are supporting as well, like if you were serving 10,000, you were able to deliver 10,000 Meals on Wheels in a month, and now you're serving treble that number, and they're more nutritious. And those are the metrics you should be using, and that's what you should be setting out in advance to say these are the goals we should be able to hit. And if there's not much purpose trying to collaborate if you don't think you're going to, if there isn't that potential for improvement of either scale, scope, or impact, and hopefully all three.
So there's a question from the audience about at what point in the process do you suggest bringing a consultant? I think it's a similar question we discussed last time, but we can elaborate on that. Each process is different, but if you were to design an ideal framework from starting to have a conversation with a potential partner to working with a consultant to bringing funders in, what is your recommended structure? Neil, if you want to jump in or?
I guess it depends a little bit, obviously from the lawyer's perspective, we consider ourselves consultants too, right? Advisors, counsel. So from my own perspective, I view these transactions as very iterative. And so I find that it's often very helpful for the client to talk to the lawyer early on, when this first is surfacing, when the board first learns that the EG is departing and that they may not want to just hire a replacement and they may want to actually think about some other more strategic move. That's when they should talk to the lawyer. That's not when the lawyer is going to do their most work, but it's very helpful, I think, for the lawyer to then lay out what some options and considerations may be, a little bit like this today. Then the client goes away and maybe hires another kind of consultant to help them actually work through the questions and the issues that have been presented. So it really depends what the client's degree of expertise and ability and capacity is to address many of the things that Jess and Daniel have already identified today by themselves. If they don't think they can really do that very comprehensively, then I would say you probably need a consultant fairly early on.
Just to jump on what Neil was saying, I think what can be really helpful in these types of conversations, particularly in the more complicated ones, is coming up with a structure for a term sheet so that you literally have like a piece of paper with the list of terms that you're trying to work out, and a lawyer or a consultant can help you form the sort of the skeleton of what a term sheet is, so that you can be negotiating, with parameters around what you're negotiating.
So I think we only have a few minutes left, so probably have the remaining question is actually for Jess, and Jess can also. Okay, go ahead. Okay.
I think it's important to, when you're bringing in a consultant, understand there's a whole network of consultants out there. There's accountants, there's lawyers, there's project managers, there's facilitators, there's IT people. There's a whole host of third-party expertise that you may need to access. Some of them come in early, some of them come in later. Definitely talk to your lawyers independently. But if you're serious about doing something together, hiring someone who works for the deal, someone like Daniel, who works for both or all the organizations, whose job it is to get up every day and say, what can I do to move this deal forward, is going to be critically important to getting to a timely decision, because this is all stuff that you're doing off the side of your desk while you're still running your organizations, still trying to serve your communities, and having to deal with the everyday stuff that just comes up. And so bringing in that mutually engaged facilitator project manager early has been a best practice that we've seen across the board in our work. Sorry, Ben.
Okay, good. I think there's two questions related to the fund I think Jess probably can address. Is that the first is more specific is, what do you think about the collective impact model in light of the COVID-19 from the perspective of funders?
I can only speak from Sea Change's perspective on collective impact. I think there's many different ways in which organizations can work together, and this recovery is going to require creative thinking about working together and perhaps structural reforms. And so if things make sense, yes, let's talk about it and see how we may be able to fund it. I think importantly for organizations who are thinking about their specific interests, not thinking about the big picture, but okay, what do we need to do to preserve our program, limit disruption, position us to be around in 3 years, because who knows what's going to happen with this next budget cycle. There's a lot of interest from funders who want to support that work, because we all know that business as usual is going to change dramatically, and it's very difficult to predict just how much it's going to change. And so to the extent that the funder community can get ready to support these early stage conversations, the later stage planning and the implementation of it, I can tell you that I've been having more conversations with funders than ever, and that people seem ready and willing to be able to invest in this, as evidenced by all of the activity that we've seen recently, including the launch of the Sustained Collaboration Network.
Yeah, great. I think Jesse kind of addressed the last question for you. That is the people asking, collaboration costs money. How can we get funders to realize this? It looks like a funder has already realized this, is ready to provide the resources to support the nonprofit, the sustained collaboration. So others? Go ahead.
Last plug I would say is there's a difference between realizing that it's important and actually cutting the checks. So if you go to the Sustained Collaboration Network site, you will see funders in specific communities who are ready to cut checks. If you're in New York, call me. I will cut checks. But it's a conversation that's evolving, and we hope to add more resources. And please know that everyone that we're talking to, we're all trying to say, how can we help preserve, sustain, and maintain the impact of this critically important sector, and just uplift this city in a time of need.
So such a nice conversation. I think I just announced that we recorded our conversation. You can check out from the Mach School website, and also in our website we will put some resources on our website, including Jesse's organization website. So you can check out from this website to get more resources. I think we have a great conversation today, and a lot of people probably going to call you guys to get more advices. And thank you very much for joining us, and we're looking forward to the future collaboration between us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you, Ben, and thanks to the Mach School for hosting.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for joining us.
Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye-bye,
Thanks,
guys.
everyone.